समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to Geopolitics with Swasti. I am Safika Sayyed and with us Dr. Swasti Rao, our consulting editor for Strategic and International Affairs. Swasti, we were just discussing this. You guys have sent us a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And
multiple question within questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is a member special show that we do, and we take questions from our members. And although all the questions that you send are very interesting, I would urge you to become a member so that we can take your questions and engage more deeply. Swasti, our first question is by Rima. They're asking, how should India interpret the latest revival of Gwadar port and CPEC infrastructure by China and Pakistan separately? Is there evidence that the recent train blast targeting Pakistani security personnel is linked to these new developments?
Now, interesting question, and you know where this is coming from, because you know just a couple of days ago it so happened that Shehbaz Sharif visited China,
Right.
and visited China, and they launched something like a CPEC 2.0. Now, why? Then you will ask the need for a CPEC 2.0 क्योंकि CPEC 1.0 तो खत्म ही नहीं हुआ था, then how come CPEC 2.0? Now the answer to that is the CPEC was one of the flagship projects of China's economic advancement around India, and it started around 2015, and even after 10 years, 11 years, it was a very ambitious one. So it starts from Kashgar in China, goes along the POK, enters Pakistan, and comes down all the way to Balochistan, and then that is where the port of Gwadar is. And you can see on the map also that how long it is. So 3,000 kilometer of basically connectivity that they intend to do. But the problem is that it has been a victim of over promise and under delivery, and particularly with respect to Gwadar, because it is in the Balochistan province of Pakistan. And you know that in the Balochistan province there is a Baloch sort of separatism that has been simmering for many decades, and those people are very determined to not let the Gwadar development and the CPC development take root. And therefore what they have done, and what the Baloch resistance fighters etc. have done, is that they have periodically targeted the Chinese engineers. So much has happened. In fact, one of the recent things that Rima has alluded to is that every time you see or you hear any development on China's engagement in that region, you will always see that there's some sort of an attack on either the infrastructure related projects or Pakistani personnel, etc. So every time when you hear any development with regard to CPEC, you will hear that these instances keep coming periodically, because long and short there is a tension out there, and then the Baloch rebels and Baloch resistance fighters do not want the Pakistani state to sort of go ahead with these plans. And as a result, some months ago it became very clear that China is in no mood to actually continue with these projects, because from China's perspective, they have been floating a China-Pakistan-Afghanistan trilateral, because what they have been wanting to do is that they have been asking Afghanistan to reduce their dependence on the Karachi port, and then have more and more engagement with Gwadar. On the contrary, what India has been wanting is that India has been, asking Afghanistan to reduce its dependence on Karachi and basically connect it to Chabahar. Now, Chabahar is a gone case for now, at least, okay, because there's so much disturbance in Iran and with what is happening in the Gulf War. But just coming and circling back to the main thing, so China's long-term strategic calculus in the region has been to have a kind of a stable mechanism with Afghanistan as well as with Pakistan. Now, that has always run into trouble, because its engagement with Pakistan always meets this, violence by the Baloch rebels. And with respect to Afghanistan, because Pakistan and Afghanistan, currently under Taliban, they keep infighting, and then there's always a problem on two sides of the Durand line. So it so appeared until about a few months ago that this entire thing would be put on a back burner, because anyway that very ambitious 3,000 kilometer long connectivity corridor could not be really developed. The investments around Gwadar were always very vulnerable to attacks and stuff like that. And I think in the middle of all that, Shehbaz Sharif made this trip to China. And what they landed up doing there is to sort of reaffirm that they are going to be doubling down on some part of that, of the entire CPEC project. And that some part is, I think, out of the 3,000 kilometer that the original plan has, they are now developing the 1,300 kilometer Karakoram, connectivity route. And then they are going to be, putting more effort in Gwadar. And for Pakistan's part, Pakistan has assured that they are going to be taking care of the security. And in fact, if you've been noticing, only recently there was news that Pakistan has again gone after the Baloch, resistance fighters. So to my mind, there is no easy respite for Pakistan, either for the Baloch problem or for the Pashtun problem, because they keep coming in cycles.
Okay.
So this is not something new. I don't see the Pakistani state really, coming out with a solution unless and until they want to go in for an all-out fight, okay? And we do see the Pakistani Air Force carrying out strikes, but like I said, so the Baloch people of the region are also very committed to not let this, progress. So by and large, this remains, to my mind, something which is still very hanging in the middle of nowhere. And yet I see that China is absolutely serious about not letting go of sort of, these connectivity ambitions and these, economic aspirations in some sense that encircle India. So, I mean, of course, CPEC one part of that. So, yeah, that is the development.
Yeah. So, Asti, now the next question also has to do with two more of our neighbors. This question is by Ranjit Pal. He's asking, Pakistan supplying Bangladesh with JF-17 Thunder Block 3 with full-scale jet combat stimulator, and USA is building a naval base in Bangladesh, St. Martin Island. Could you just...
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What has happened is that Pakistani media recently reported that they have transferred fully operational simulators of the JF-17s to Bangladesh. Now, this is interesting because, I mean, why would they transfer fully operational simulators unless there is an intent on the Bangladeshi side to buy more, fighters, the J-17 fighters. Now, as of now, there is no deal which is inked, but yeah, I mean, like Pakistan always goes around saying, even if there is a little bit of a discussion on something, Pakistani media reports and a lot of other media reports also go around saying that, I mean, putting it as if the deal has been finalized. And that's a problem because more often than not that these deals are not finalized, but then you will hear some kind of a preliminary discussion around it. However, in the case of JF-17s, it is true that a fully operational simulator has been transferred. Whether or not the deal will be inked later, that remains to be seen. Now, the JF-17 particularly has been in news lately because, it has sort of offered itself as a cost-effective solution with a lot of modular capabilities in the sense that it can, really integrate lots of different kinds of different philosophies of weapons, etc. And for a lot of countries that do not have a lot of, bandwidth, financial bandwidth to go in for big ticket purchases of, very advanced fighter jets, I think J-17 pitches itself as a cost-effective solution. So that's one part. But, I think there is something which we tend to miss when we look at these. Okay, Pakistan is selling something to Bangladesh, and what does it mean for India? Now, just if you talk by numbers, right, it means nothing. I mean, Bangladesh Air Force has maybe only 44 fighter jets or something, and many of them are already aging. So Bangladesh does not have, compare that to, 400, 500 fighter jets that India has if you put all our, jets together of different squadrons and different types. So it does not really pose any threat to India if you just look at the numbers. But that is where you need perspective and not numbers. And what is this perspective I'm talking about? The perspective here is, Hapika, that if you look at India and if you look at our problems, so on one hand we have Pakistan, on the other hand we have China. And our real problem is that China is propping up Pakistan, right? Now, when it comes to Pakistan, although we have a linear edge over Pakistan, but when it's come to China, China has an exponential edge over us. Now, what perspective I'm talking about is that China today is not only the largest defense supplier to three of our neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. But the second biggest supplier to at least two of these countries, which is Pakistan and Bangladesh, is Turkey. So the perspective that we require to understand what is going on is not just a sale here or a sale there. The perspective that we require is an intermingling of defense ecosystems of countries that are hostile to India's interests. So the rising footprint of not only China, but also of Turkey, there are, so for example, when you look at a Bangladesh situation where Pakistan and China co-produce jets such as the J-17s are now getting, a fully operational simulator, that is not the end of the story. That's simply the beginning of the story. Because then if you look at the Turkish angle, the Turkish and Bangladeshi defense ecosystem has been seeing a certain kind of a merger that was not there earlier. For example, in a lot of air defenses, Turkey has set up a lot of, exclusive defense zones in Bangladesh. And you see that there is a rising footprint. Similarly, if you look at Sri Lanka, even though Turkey is not really the second largest defense supplier, the first largest defense supplier is still China, but Turkey is getting more and more relevant in the ship building capabilities and in the, in maritime capability building of Sri Lanka. So cutting a long story short, the point that I want to underscore here is that when we are looking at our subcontinent and when we are looking at these deals, it is better to not look at them into isolation, because in isolation it may not tell much. But when you connect these dots and you see a certain kind of a defense ecosystem, a certain kind of subsystem defense bonhomie getting created, okay, among countries that may have hostile interests, to India's, that is where I think we need to be strategically careful, right? It's just one deal doesn't really matter. And to the second part of that question on US's interest in Saint Martin, I think this is, please don't buy these conspiracy theories. Like I said just now, that it is very clear to everybody who does any data analysis on any, technical analysis or on where things are going. What you see is a rising footprint by China, a rising footprint by Pakistan, as a rising footprint by Turkey.
Right.
And the Department of State has gone on record several times denying that they have any interest in the Saint Martin, island or setting up a base. So I think we have to come out of this habit of putting too much emphasis on conspiracy theories because kuch na kuch to US ne kiya hoga, and get more real about who are the real actors and real players here, right? And I think that is the whole point that I was trying to tell you about the perspective earlier. Right. So I have not seen any development, so to say, and since the State Department has itself negated it several times, I don't have any reason to believe, it's okay to sort of have ties with Bangladesh, but I don't think that it qualifies for the same conspiracy, theory that it usually is put across as. Yeah.
Very important to see it as it is, and which is why we have you here to break it down for us.
Okay.
Now, Rima also has a question on Bangladesh and Pakistan relations. She's asking, to what extent does Bangladesh cooperation with Pakistan in civil services training affect India's strategic and diplomatic interests?
Okay, now again, interesting. So what has happened was that, of course, it has a background, and the background is that ever since Bangladeshi liberation, India has been the prime actor, right? And India has always sort of enjoyed this very central space in Bangladeshi affairs for very obvious reasons. I mean, one doesn't have the time to keep going back in history, but of course we feel that Bangladesh owes its existence to us, right? Which is quite true if you look at the 1971 experience. Now, what had happened was that the Bangladeshi civil servants had been coming to India to train at Mussoorie, and this is again one part of cooperation, right? Institutional cooperation. Not just that, I mean, if you look at the armed forces also, those officers also come and train. But since your question is on the civil services, I'll just keep it there. Now, what happened was that after Sheikh Hasina's ouster, the current agreement that we had with Bangladesh, it expired in April 2025, and ever since it has not been renewed, and we are already in May 2026. Right. Now, let alone the fact that we were waiting for this to be renewed, or I don't know, I'm not privy to the conversations happening, in that regard. But all of a sudden we heard news that Bangladesh, on the contrary, has struck its first ever, agreement with Pakistan. And now these diplomats are going to be sent to Pakistan, to Lahore, where they are going to be getting training. Now, again, if you look at it in isolation, perhaps it doesn't mean much. But if you again put the entire thing into perspective, which is that, okay, after Sheikh Hasina's ouster, Sheikh Hasina was seen pretty much as an, India-backed candidate. She is still in India, in exile. Yeah, she's here in exile. And the fact that there is a new government in Bangladesh, and even though technically we have signaled that we are open for all kinds of ties, but having said that, you see that these small little things, somewhere show that Bangladesh is in no mood for a real rapprochement with India, right? So we do see a kind of a strategic deepening happening that Bangladesh is doing, not just with China, but also with, Pakistan. And I think somewhere it sort of takes on a very different character if you add another part, which has got to do with now a new government in
Right.
West Bengal. And I think there's a question on that, so
Yeah.
I'll wait for it. But yes, it is true that it is the first ever time, and it has never happened in the history of Bangladesh, because, for Bangladesh, Pakistan has been the aggressor, right? So now we are in a situation where the aggressor so far is turning into a friend.
Yeah.
So definitely we must, there is nothing to panic. But yes, this is something which we must take note of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So clearly, lots of things are changing
Yeah,
for
of course.
Bangladesh.
Yeah, yeah.
And now its relationship with India has also come into flux on certain subjects. Narendra Arya's question is: after BJP's win in West Bengal election, there was a lot of noise that illegal immigrants will be sent back to Bangladesh. And of course, the CM has also said that, and our Home Minister Amit Shah has also said that we will have a policy of detect, delete, deport.
Yeah.
Again. So they're asking, it seems that this time the migrants are really cornered and will be sent back.
Yeah.
In this aggressive illegal immigrant stance, how do you see Bangladesh will react?
Okay. Now, again, an interesting question, and because it just adds to our larger discussion on Bangladesh. Now, the newly elected government, which is a BJP government in West Bengal, Suvendu Adhikari, who's the new chief minister. Now, they have maintained it with a lot of clarity that repatriating these illegal migrants is a core issue,
Right.
right? And you mentioned so many statements, etc. Now, this came early on in the month of May, of course, and then basically both the Bangladeshi foreign minister and the Bangladeshi home minister, so Khalilur Rahman, who's the foreign minister, and Salahuddin Ahmed, who's the home minister. So both these leaders, right, responded to this particular stance and said that they hope there's no such Bangladesh pushing such migrants back into Bangladesh, etc. And then if they do it forcibly, then they are going to be taking action. Now, of course, this adds to a bit of more discomfort between us and Bangladeshi ties, which are not really in the best of form. But what we have noticed is that towards the end of the May, and this is just 1 month,
Right.
ever since the new government has come and all these statements have been coming. So what we have seen in the last few days is that several of these migrants have, voluntarily tried to go back to Bangladesh, saying that they don't want to be put into that situation where they are withheld and they are, put into that they are detained and they're having to undergo all sorts of diplomatic stress, etc. So many of them have taken a voluntary kind of a recourse and they want to go back to Bangladesh. So, so the point is that we do not know how the situation will pan out. It has really only been 1 month. We have seen a volley of statements from both sides. Nobody wants to really, disturb the situation beyond a point of control. But despite that, I would say that let's wait and watch how it pans out.
Okay.
And let's not take these statements only on face value, because end of the day, these are going to be larger, questions of law and order,
Yeah.
larger questions of stability, and nobody would want to get their hands dirtied over something which probably might have another way of being looked at. But my point is, let's not jump the gun and let's sort of revisit this after a few months to really see what is the number. Is it a staggering number? Has there been any violence, etc., etc.? Just based on a couple of statements, it's better to sort of have some patience.
Right. Now, Swasti, the next question is by Anubhav Saxena. He's asking, what are the positive and negative outcomes that you collect from PM Modi's recent EU tour of 4 nations?
Right.
And will Modi visit France again for the Rafale deal?
Okay. Let me take the second part of this question first, because it's an easier thing. And then France has been a best friend of ours. So it's always, it's a feel good to talk about the best friend first. So in the case of this particular question, which is to do with the Rafales, this is about the 114
Right.
additional Rafales. And even though it has been reported so much in the media, I mean, one tends to think as if the deal is done and dusted. But frankly, if you ask me where it stands technically, what has finally happened is the letter of request, the LOR has been finalized.
Okay.
Now it means that once the letter of request is finalized, it is a government to government document, it's a G2G document basically. Now it will be sent to France in a few weeks. Then the French side is going to respond. Then there will be a RFP, which is called a request for proposal. After the request for proposal is finalized, it will enter price negotiations, etc. Finally, after that, there will be a CCS approval for it. So it has several, stages to go. This
Right.
is just the first step, so to say, and so much celebration is happening as if only for the first stage, and it gives an impression as if the entire thing is now done, which is not the case. Now, will Prime Minister Modi go to France for it? Okay, now Prime Minister Modi is slated to go to France in mid-June.
Okay.
And this is for the G7 summit. The French President Emmanuel Macron has invited Prime Minister Modi for attending the G7 summit. I mean, Prime Minister has been invited to several of these G7 summits, and I think as far as the program is known so far, Prime Minister is going to be going to France and Slovakia.
Okay.
Now, just to connect it to your question, do you think that, or do you expect the Rafale deal to be announced then? No, that's not the case, because like I said, that it's only the letter of request that has finally been finalized, and it is now going to go to the French side. Maybe you will hear some sort of a progress on that part, but the deal cannot be inked, or the deal cannot be finally announced before the end of this year, technically. And this is when I am hoping that things will go as per the timeline shared. So Modi will go to France, but we don't expect the Rafale deal to be announced this time around.
Yeah.
And now coming to the first part, right? And what was the first part of his question?
That what do you collect from PM Modi's recent
the
YouTube?
Europe tour. Very interesting, very high voltage tour. Lot of controversies also around it. But let me just break it down for you. So Prime Minister Modi went to 4 countries, from Netherlands, then Sweden, then Norway, and then on his way back to Italy, right? And while going from here, of course, he also went to UAE and he signed a defense cooperation agreement, but then that's a different theater, so we'll leave that for the while. Let's talk about Europe. So he started from Netherlands, like I said, and Netherlands is a country which has been actually very important for India. We don't really generally expect, such a country to be so important, such a country as in such a small country in Europe to be so important, and that is why you should know more about it. Netherlands-India trade is already about $28 billion.
Okay.
And out of the $28 billion, the total trade with Netherlands, about $18 billion is India's exports. Okay. So you can totally understand this is a huge Indian surplus, right? One. Second, Netherlands and India have a very important and robust semiconductor partnership. Okay. And third, Netherlands is one country with whom we have a very deep partnership on role of AI in military technology.
Okay.
Right? And then Netherlands is a country that has an Indo-Pacific strategy. In fact, if you remember, just I think few weeks ago, I had done a worldview when the Dutch general of the Royal Navy, because that frigate was docking in Kochi and he was in India and then he came to New Delhi, etc. So Netherlands is a very important player, in India's strategic calculus. And also remember that this time around, the relationship was elevated to a strategic partnership level. And I'd already told you, the numbers, so you can totally understand why Netherlands is so important. Now, after Netherlands, he went to Sweden. Now, Sweden is, the trade with Sweden is not definitely as much as we have with Netherlands. The trade with Sweden is just about $8 billion or so. But Sweden is very important for our defense ecosystem, because Sweden's defense giant Saab made history recently when they got a full waiver, to do 100% investment in India's FDI, India's defense sector. Right? Generally, according to the DAP, which is Defense Acquisition Procedure, according to the Defense Acquisition Procedure, there is a cap. You can only do it up to 79%. Okay. In the best case scenario. But Saab became the first ever defense giant to get 100%, limit. And that is for the Carl Gustaf systems that we co-produce with Sweden. Now, of course, like I told you, Sweden is important for that. Then from there, he went to Norway. And Norway became the most controversial part because of this young journalist who tended to ask Mr. Prime Minister a question that he did not answer, and later on she had a bit of a face-off with the MEA spokesperson, etc. But that is all for the wrong reason. The most important thing that nobody really cared to understand as to why did Prime Minister choose Norway, okay? Prime Minister chose to go to Norway because Norway is a part of the EFTA group. Norway is not a part of the EU, okay? Norway is just a part of NATO, not a part of the EU. So the current FTA that India is negotiating, which is already finalized, but now we are negotiating the terms, etc. We are, smoothing out the different legal terms. So Netherlands, Sweden, Italy are all part of that FTA, but Norway is separate, is a standalone country in that regard. Norway is a part of EFTA. EFTA is a group of 4 European countries which has Norway, Iceland, Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And out of these 4, Norway is absolutely so important. You know why? Because Norway, a small country in the Nordic region, has the sovereign wealth fund of about $2.5 trillion, right? Our entire GDP is $4 trillion, right? And their sovereign wealth fund is $2.5 trillion. Norway is a giant exporter of oil and gas. Okay, and I've done an opinion piece and a video column also on it. But basically, the idea is that we want to invest. We want Norway and Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund to invest in India. In the last couple of years, particularly in the last financial years, they had already invested in India, but their share of holdings in India actually reduced.
Okay.
Right? And this came at the same time when their share of holding in countries like Taiwan or China went up, right? So that was one thing that we were very particular about, because we definitely want Norway and its vast sovereign wealth funds to keep investing in India. And second, because there has been a bit of a controversy with Adani Group, because Norway barred investments, barred Adani Group from investments because, they were doing something that they did not find justified in Myanmar, and then later on something else.
Okay.
So basically, I think the idea was to attract more sovereign wealth fund investments into India, and Norway definitely has an immense financial bandwidth. And finally, just to add to another thing, while Prime Minister was in Norway, he also did a summit called the India Nordic Summit.
Yeah.
Now you will ask me, apart from these 4 countries that I already mentioned, what is the Nordic Summit? So the Nordic group, okay, or the Nordic Council is a group of 5 Nordic countries, which has, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Iceland and Norway. And this particular summit also happened in Norway. This was the 3rd time that Prime Minister was doing it. Now, if you look carefully, these are countries with whom we have, a lot of green partnerships, a lot of, those kind of things, because they are pioneers in renewables, etc. But end of the day, what I'm saying is that this was a high voltage trip where only in 4 days he just achieved so much. And while on his way back, he went to Italy, where I think a lot of attention was given to the melody and the strategic melody between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Meloni. But the thing again to understand is that with Italy, we have about $16-17 billion worth of trade. Again, it is our trade surplus.
Okay.
And we already have signed, something called the Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement with Italy, which basically enables and facilitates more trade. So the idea is to quickly take the trade figures to 20 billion and so on, because of course Italy is a big market, and then it is again a relationship which is our export surplus. Second, with Italy, important, for a long time there was a bad blood between Indian and Italian defense companies because of a certain controversy. I don't have the time to get into. I've spoken about it a lot earlier. But because of a lot of, I would say, bonhomie between the 2 heads of state lately, and then Italy has joined the Biofuel Alliance and all of that, we also saw that the Ministry of Defense, the Indian Ministry of Defense, actually removed those Italian companies from the restricted list. Okay, and then in a very short time, you see that whether it's Leonardo, which is a giant in, like a lot of helicopters and air defense, solutions, or whether it's Fincantieri, which is known to be a giant in naval solutions, submarines, etc., or other Italian companies that are known to be very good with midget submarines and other EW sensors and EW capabilities, etc. Their footprint in India has been rising. So basically what I see in terms of positives is that I think in a very short span of 4 days, the Prime Minister could touch upon all these things, which actually seem quite spectacular. And the negative was that so much of that was just consumed by this controversy around this journalist, when the real thing was something else.
Now, Swasti, the next question is by Anubhav Saxena. He's asking, recently there was a visit by Cyprus PM to India. Did it have any weight? Can India form an alliance with Greece and Cyprus against Turkey-Pakistan nexus? Do these countries bring anything for India, or it's only for media hype?
Right. It's a good question. And I would say that you are also able to gauge really a lot of rhetoric from reality. And I'll tell you why. Now, just Cyprus. Now, Cyprus seems like one country, but Cyprus is basically, there are two countries that are called Cyprus. One is Northern Cyprus and then there's Cyprus. So
Okay.
the particular head of state that had visited India just now came from Cyprus, because Northern Cyprus is the one that was invaded by Turkey
Okay.
in the 1970s. Okay, so it has a particular context. And anyway, now to your question, let me give you an analytic framework for you to remember. Now, most in the recent years, most of India's outreach to a lot of Mediterranean Europe countries, whether it's France or whether it's Spain or Italy or Greece or Cyprus, it fits into the Indo-Mediterranean construct that India is very, very actively seeking and developing after Indo-Pacific. So just like Indo-Pacific is a very important geopolitical construct, and the minute you say that Indo-Pacific order, Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, it just brings a whole host of activities and a whole host of actors, etc. Right? Similarly, now what India has been doing lately in the last few years is doubling down on the construct called Indo-Mediterranean. Why? Because India understands that a lot of India's economic connectivity projects, whether it's IMEC or whether it's building more strategic gateways into Europe, or whether it's about doubling down on on the African flank, whatever, you require a very robust Indo-Mediterranean strategy. So one is that it is a larger part of India's Mediterranean outreach. Okay, the Indo-Mediterranean. Now, particularly with respect to Cyprus, like I said, that there you see a kind of a balancing happening, because you have a situation where Turkey actively supports Pakistan on the question of Kashmir, okay, and not just and especially at the Organization of Islamic Countries, and that is something which India has always objected to. That has not always been the case. This has become the case under Erdogan, because Erdogan projects himself as the leader of the Muslim world, and for that he also has a like a competition going on with Saudi Arabia that obviously houses Mecca and Medina. So obviously Saudi Arabia has a different kind of a legitimacy to call itself the leader. And to add to that, Pakistan was also diplomatically supported by Turkey on during Operation Sindoor. Now, because of a variety of these reasons, in fact, not just that, Pakistan has also been actively collaborating with Turkey on a lot of things in defense ecosystem. Pakistani Navy has been actively collaborating with Turkey in their exercises, which have direct implications for Greece and Greek territorial waters, etc. So I mean, there is a lot of actually going on in that space, okay? And then Greece and Turkey don't see eye to eye because Greece and Turkey have jhagda over their EEZ, etc. And Greece has so many islands, and it is not possible for Greece to basically control all these islands, and Turkey obviously is the bigger power. So there is a lot of tension there. Now, from India's perspective, India then develops deeper ties with countries like Greece and countries like Cyprus for a natural balancing of Pakistan and Turkey together. Now, what is a more important part of your question is that what do you expect out of it, right? I personally think that while India is ensuring that its strategic depth rises in the region with respect to more, joint exercises, with respect to more presence, with respect to more such diplomatic overtures with the Cypriot Prime Minister and then Prime Minister Modi going there last year, etc. But frankly, this is where it ends, because even if you look at the current roadmap, India and Cyprus then signed a roadmap, and the roadmap talks about diplomatic collaboration, cultural collaboration, cybersecurity collaboration, defense collaboration. But then again, I think a real game changer would be if India and Greece can enter into some kind of a co-production and then start co-producing and co-exporting defense equipment for Cyprus, right? Or I can give you an example, because Cyprus is it buys a lot of stuff from Israel. So there is something called a Barak 8, SAM, which is surface-to-air missile that India buys from Israel. And then basically what we do is that there is a collaboration between DRDO and IAI, the Israel Aerospace Industries, and then we co-produce that Barak 8, SAM.
Right.
Cyprus uses the advanced Israeli-made Barak MX air defense system, which is again manufactured by the same. Israel Aerospace Industries. So if we can enter into some kind of a synergy where India and Israel start to co-produce equipment and then co-export it for Cyprus, or India and Greece start to co-produce and co-export, it is only then that it will really have some teeth. Because other than that, assume tomorrow there is a war going on there. Do you think India is going to deploy troops? No, that is not happening. So much of that is a counterbalancing, which is more diplomatic and strategic in nature. It doesn't really carry any, hidden troop deployment, etc. It's like a power projection that, okay, you are going to destabilize here, we are going to be active in a theater which is sensitive to yours. But it can only take on teeth and take on some meat if you really get into these kind of collaborations. In my opinion, there is a lot of potential for that, especially about the Israeli example I just gave you. But unfortunately, even though Israel is a great defense partner to us, Israel has been very closed on this question of co-producing and co-exporting. Right? As far as India is concerned, they do it. But as far as exporting similar equipment to other third parties is concerned, I have not seen a lot of, willingness on the Israeli part. Maybe it can change later, but so far we have not seen.
Now, Swasti, the next question is referencing Rubio's visit to India. This question is by Ankit Sahu. They're asking, Rubio lands in Kolkata 8 days after Trump and Xi declared strategic stability in Beijing and 4 days before the Quad foreign ministers meet. He says the choreography is unmistakable, consolation diplomacy for a marginalized partner. With tariffs intact, the Russian oil penalty unmoved and the Apple warning unwithdrawn, is this a genuine reset of India-US ties or theatre to keep India inside the Quad without Washington paying the price?
Right. Interesting question. And I love it. You know why? Because my column is on this, right? Why I mentioned that India is no longer the centerpiece for United States Indo-Pacific strategy as a counterbalance against China. Now, very quickly, couple of things we have to be careful about here, because there is a tendency to sort of overread and sometimes misread into what is happening in the world. Now, I feel that this entire thing of the world now being divided by the G2, so to say, is a little exaggerated, because, if you look carefully, the United States and China do have structural rivalries, okay? They haven't gone anywhere, right? So there is a competition, there is a trade war, there is a, there is a semiconductor war, there's a technology war, etc., etc. Everything is going on, okay? So you can't say that suddenly these guys have kissed and made up. It's not like that. I think what has happened is that Donald Trump, as he has come back as US president, has started to have a different approach to China, okay? And that different approach basically has come at the cost of India because, for the longest time, there was a belief in New Delhi circles that US is putting India at the forefront of its Indo-Pacific strategy because US needs India. Right. India is the indispensable partner. Now, from India's perspective, it made perfect sense because we are 1.5 billion people, our geographical location in the Indian Ocean region, us being a democracy, etc., our bilateral ties going very steady and I would say very well with the United States in the last 20 years. So it made perfect sense. And there was also bipartisan consensus. And one more thing, just as Donald Trump was getting inaugurated as the president the second time, I had so many Americans come here in studio, speak to me and tell me that Quad is going to be the centerpiece of Donald Trump's administration. So we all have misread him, right? We were expecting a different kind of a bonhomie, and what has happened is a complete destruction of, or complete, so to say, failure of that kind of a reading. Our expectations have not been met, okay? Yeah. In fact, what we landed up was a complete undermining of India's strategic positioning, etc. Now, this is something that we have talked about a lot of times, Habika. So, in short, what I can tell you is that Marco Rubio's visit to India basically signaled that there is a certain continuity and that there is a bit of a damage control, right? And I think that's it, okay? It did not really come up with big ticket announcements. It did not come up with some paradigm shifts, But having said that, I also noticed that some months ago, India and the US, they renewed their 10-year defense framework, which means that the institutional frameworks are in place. If you look at the recently, just during Trump months, okay, the last 15 months, India has purchased quite a lot of defense equipment from the United States. India has purchased a lot of energy from the United States. Indians have invested so much in the United States, right? United States has invested so much in India. And, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal was recently in Washington to basically talk about and finally finalize the trade deal.
deal, yeah.
So the way I look at it is that even though India is not central to the Indo-Pacific strategy, because there the United States under Donald Trump wants its partners to do more. Okay, you do the burden sharing, you do more, you do the heavy lifting. Yes, it is there. They are not shelving Quad, but they are not as enthusiastic about
Yeah.
Quad. Okay, this is something that we have to understand. It doesn't mean that Quad is going to disappear. Basically, what it means is that we have to lie low, bide our time, and then work on the bilaterals. Because
Yeah.
one of the ways to actually make Quad work, remember, it is a function-driven organization. There are two ways in which international organizations can work. Either form can drive them, which means structure. So think of like SARC, that you have a permanent secretariat, etc., etc. Or the function can drive them, which means purpose,
Yeah.
a convergence of interest. So Quad was always given as this wonderful example of what can happen even in the absence of permanent secretariat and permanent, treaties, etc., etc. Still, the sheer convergence of interest can drive this in a very meaningful way forward. And this is what we saw after COVID, when in 2021 it was elevated to the leaders level summit, etc. And achanak kya ho gaya? The Donald Trump lost all interest. But this is how it is. So instead of decoding it too much, what we have to understand is that the Quad will stay. The Quad has seen worse days, so it will see better days. But for now, this is what it is.
Right.
And basically, it shows that there was damage control and continuity, but don't read too much into it. And second, like I mentioned, I just want to connect the dots back to where I started. Don't read too much into this G2, because this basically somewhere then again sort of really trivializes the kind of structural differences that United States and China has. Perhaps in the longer run, Donald Trump would be an aberration.
Right. Now, Swasti, the last question for this episode takes us a little away from home. This question is by Lakshmi Narayan. He's asking, how significant is German government's order about males 17 to 45 needing permission to go out of the country for more than 3 months?
Right. No, he's right. I mean, there is I think earlier this year, it was clarified by the German defense minister itself. So they have come out with something called a Military Service Modernization Act. And it has also come into effect, okay, which basically says that if there are males within a certain age period, and this is like 17 to 45, and if they are leaving the country for more than 3 months, they need a special permission. And without overreading too much into it, I will just say that this is definitely a kind of a German preparation to modernize their military preparedness and to sort of work on their military preparedness in the face of Russia's war in Ukraine, which has been going on for the last 4-5 years, and which has been pretty much I would say a paradigm shift for the European security theater. So it's just that, sitting here, we have this tendency of sometimes either, trivializing it, or perhaps sort of, not really understanding the details of how much it has impacted the European security theater. But this is what it is. So, so far, we only know some details. We know that there is a law like that exists. There are many more details which are not yet known. So, for example, what happens if you were to breach it? What happens, if somebody were to require some kind of a relief from there, etc. So, we do not know about that. I at least do not know, about it. But yes, as far as that is concerned, it has come. It is true, and it is a part of their military preparedness and modernization.
Right. Yeah. Now we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, and you said how it was a paradigm shift for Europe's security.
Yeah.
Lakshmi Narayan has a question on that. He's asking, Russia firing ballistic missiles into Ukraine, is this a sign of a new round of intense war, or does this signal the last phase? An additional question they're asking is that, could you please explain the long-term financial implications of the war financing for Ukraine?
Yeah.
They read somewhere that Britain was still repaying the World War time debt from US.
Okay.
Will Ukraine be doing the same to Europe?
Right. Okay, so the second question is much more technical because it requires a bit of fine-tuning into what is going on. Let me answer the first part of that question. And Russia launching Oshchennik missiles, basically the ballistic missiles, etc. What has happened, unfortunately, in the last 15 months is that when Trump became the US president, he had a particular approach towards the Russia-Ukraine war, which was a very pro-Russia, pro-Putin approach. In fact, his entire premise rested on the fact that Europe and Ukraine do not matter. Putin and Trump are going to sit in a room, and that's how the Alaska summit had happened, if you remember, when he rolled out a red carpet for Putin. But to cut a long story short, because it is indeed a very long story, because so much has happened between, what Donald Trump has done for Ukraine and then announced a ceasefire. The ceasefire broke down. Then he spoke to Putin. Then he spoke to Ukraine. Then he said something bad about Putin. Then he said something good about Ukraine. It just went went on and on. But what I'm saying is that in the last 15 months, there was a perfect window for Putin to actually end this war militarily, because United States, which was the biggest military supporter of Ukraine, at least until the Biden administration, it reduced its military assistance to zero. And all of that was then compensated for by Europe. Now, naturally, Europe did not compensate it overnight. It also took its own time. And that was the period in February 2025
Right.
when things had gone so bad that everybody thought it's just a matter of few days. And now we are in May 2026 and Ukraine is actually, striking every day inside the Russian territory. So what has happened is that my reading is that Russia, despite all the reputation of its military prowess, is simply not able to finish the war militarily. And when I say militarily, the war is going on for Donbass. Okay, Donbass is a region that comprises of two provinces, Donetsk and Lugansk.
Yeah.
And Donetsk and Lugansk are not 100% in Russian control. Ukrainians are saying that if you have not won it militarily, we are not going to gift it to you. And that is the battlefront. Now, instead of finishing that war on that battlefront and taking Donbass, because taking Donbass has been given as one of the war aims by Putin, the war is just continuing. Ukraine is also developing more and more offensive capabilities. They are now striking deep inside Russia.
Yeah.
They have unleashed their own Flamingo missiles, which is a cruise missile. Now they have been unleashing ballistic missiles. And now they have gained ability to now strike on Moscow. As you know, several times it is reported that Moscow airport flights are suspended, internet is suspended, the refineries are bombed. So this kind of a retaliation that you saw from Putin was basically that frustration
Right.
of trying to push Ukraine into capitulation by saying that, okay, we have much bigger weapons than you. But like I said, that just bombing Ukraine is not going to solve the problem, because if you really want to solve the problem, just finish the war in Donbass, right? So that you have something to go, something that you can call an off-ramp. Off-ramp is a concept that has been talked about so much, right, in recent war analysis. So off-ramp, you need an off-ramp. So Putin requires an off-ramp, and that off-ramp is not going to come by targeting civilians or targeting all this, because it's simply stretching on the war. And the other thing which is very clear is that Donald Trump is unable to stop this war because Europeans have filled that space. Okay, so basically, to my mind, there is a significant escalation happening in the war. Second, I think Ukraine's ability to develop its own long-range missiles also somewhere gives Ukraine the space to target wherever they want.
Yeah.
Okay, and they have been pretty good at it. And then Russia is retaliating. So long and short, there is an escalation. It is dangerous. And my reading is that this can't go on for too long. But definitely I see that 2027 is a time when we should be expecting some kind of a ceasefire, because both sides will run out of the capabilities to go on, doing this, because there is a limit to how much destruction can you handle, not just for Ukraine, but also for Russia. Look at how many refineries of theirs have been targeted. It's mind-boggling. Nobody expected that. Now they are airlifting air defense systems on top of Moscow high rises because they're so scared about Ukrainian drone attacks. The Moscow the Victory Day parade on 9th of May was completely devoid of any heavy military equipment because they were afraid of Ukrainian drone attacks. So it is not just about damage in Ukraine, which is very evident, but it is also about damage in Russia, because Russia here is the bigger power, right? So I see that somewhere 2027, but my submission here is that it's easy for Putin to finish it if he's able to win the war in Donbass. Yeah.
And then how much is this war costing?
Okay. So the war cost is staggering. And then you had a question on how Europe is going to be financing Ukraine. And that's where we have to somewhere understand, Zabika, that for Europe, they have been looking at it as their own existential threat, right?
Okay.
So we tend to think that, Europeans should not be really supporting the war. But if you ask the Europeans, it is very important for their security. And like I said, that for many years under Biden administration, it was basically United States that was giving that aid. Especially the military assistance was going from United States, right? Europe particularly the EU, the member states were giving their own respective, contributions. But at the EU-wide level, they were basically taking care of macro financial assistance and macroeconomic packages and humanitarian assistance and all that. But after Donald Trump coming to power, the situation has radically changed. Donald Trump has stopped giving any assistance to Ukraine, like America has stopped giving any assistance to Ukraine. All that it is now doing is that selling weapons, which is paid for by European money. So if you look at what Europe has spent, Europe has so far spent about $200 plus billion on Ukraine, $200 billion. And then if you look at the broad categories, it is, of course, the major part is financial and economic assistance, which is, more than $105 billion. Then now, especially in the last 15 months, it's also military aid, which is now close to, $80-90 billion, because Europe is now stepping in with that aid. And there's also refugee support, which is another $20 billion, $25 billion, etc. Okay, now, you asked me what is the bandwidth, how long can they go on, supporting Ukraine. Now, like I said, that they think that they have no other choice but to go on supporting Ukraine, because if Ukraine falls, then they are the frontline states, okay? So they have to keep Ukraine standing.
Right.
That is how they look at it. Also, you have to understand that Europe has tremendous financial bandwidth that we sometimes tend to miss. So the the EU, GDP is close to $23-24 trillion. And if you compare this 204 billion that they have spent on Ukraine so far, it is not even 1% of the GDP. And this is not in 1 year, this is in 4 years, okay? Which goes on to show that actually Europe can do more, because in terms of financial bandwidth, they have it. Now, to your question, how is Ukraine going to repay it? Because obviously Ukraine is a war-ravaged country. Two things. One is that if you look at the European Parliament papers, they have already sort of started to ready another $100-200 billion package, 200 euro package for Ukraine for the next 10 years.
Right.
Okay. Now, they have a lot of financial instruments by which they are planning to mobilize that money. But as far as repaying it is concerned, I have to tell you that Ukraine is not going to directly repay this, this loan to European and G7 partners. So basically, the repayment, so to say, is not coming directly, but it is going to come from the profits which are made on the frozen Russian assets. In fact, if you may be hearing in news, every now and then, Ukraine gets about 3 billion or 5 billion, which is basically interest earned on the money which is frozen, the Russian money which is frozen. Similarly, there are other things also. Then again, what the Europeans are doing is that they are asking Russia to give war reparations. I don't think Russia is going to pay any war reparations, just like United States is not going to pay any war reparations to Iran. So I think that is quite settled. But then there is also, certain EU budget guarantees. So basically, not to complicate it too much, the point is that Ukraine is not supposed to repay all of that directly.
Right.
Ukraine will definitely get a lot of, I would say, advantage and a lot of leeway in repaying it over a long period of time. And I already see a lot of that beginning, because the manner in which the primary European powers have entered into long-term defense, agreements with Ukraine, that's all co-production.
Okay.
So right now they're doing it for Ukraine. After a while, Ukraine will start producing for the European partners. So we will see a kind of a combination of factors, but don't be under the impression that Europe doesn't have the bandwidth. I just gave you the numbers. It's not even in 4 years, it's not even 0.1% of their entire GDP.
Yeah.
So they definitely have the bandwidth. In fact, the critics would say that Europe is not doing enough. Right? And yes, this doesn't really tackle the question of UK, because here I focused on Europe, okay? I didn't really look at the other G7, because that's probably another story for another day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Swasti. That brings us to the end of this episode. I would urge you again to become members. You send us such interesting questions. We would love to engage with you more deeply. We'll be back again next week with another episode of Geopolitics with Swasti.